Welcome back. It's Wednesday. I've been awake since 4 a.m. in the morning or night. So that's 10 a.m. Let's read. So I've been up like 6 hours. So let's reading. Oh, the sun is shining, so the temperature will get up again to like 30 degrees. Now it's 25. It's been 25 the whole night, and thunder and lightning. But in like 1 hour, the sun will start shining into my apartment in less 1 hour. Then the temperature will get up to 30 degrees or more.
M1 Abrams. M1 tank redirects here. For the early 20th century light tank, see M1 combat car. The M1 Abrams, /Abrams/, is a third-generation American main battle tank designed by Chrysler Defense, now General Dynamics Land Systems, and named for General Creighton Abrams. Conceived for modern armored ground warfare, it is one of the heaviest tanks in service at nearly 73.6 short tons, 66.8 metric tons. It introduced several modern technologies to United States Armored Forces, including a multi-fuel turbine engine, sophisticated Cavorn composite armor, a computer fire control system, separate ammunition storage in a blowout compartment, and NBC protection for crew safety. Initial models of the M1 were armed with a 105mm M68 gun, while later variants feature license-produced Rheinmetall 120mm L/44 designated M256. The M1 Abrams was developed from the failed joint American-West German MBT-70 project that intended to replace the obsolete M60 tank. There are three main operational Abrams versions: the M1, M1A1, and M1A2, with each new iteration seeing improvements in armament, protection, and electronics. The Abrams was to be replaced in U.S. Army service by the XM1202 Mounted Combat System, but because that project was cancelled, the Army has opted to continue maintaining and operating the M1 series for the foreseeable future by upgrading optics, armor, and firepower. The M1 Abrams entered service in 1980 and serves as the main battle tank of the United States Army and formerly of the United States Marine Corps, USMC, until the decommissioning of all USMC tank battalions in 2021. The export modification is used by the armed forces of Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Poland and Iraq. The Abrams was first used in combat by the U.S. in the Gulf War. It was later deployed by the U.S. in the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq War, as well as by Iraq in the war against the Islamic State, Saudi Arabia in the Yemeni Civil War, and Ukraine in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. History, edit. Main article, History of the M1 Abrams. Previous developments, edit. Main article, MBT-70. In 1963, the U.S. Army and the West German Bundeswehr began collaborating on a main battle tank, MBT, design that both nations would use, improving interoperability between the two NATO partners. The MBT-70, or Kampfpanzer 70 as it was known in Germany, incorporated many new unconventional technologies across the board. Conventional tanks of the time had a crew of 4, with the driver located in the hull. In the MBT-70, the loader crew member would be replaced by a mechanical autoloader and the driver would be located inside the NBC protected turret with the other 2 crew members. Like the M60A2 MBT and M551 Sheridan light tank then under development, the MBT-70 was armed with a 152mm gun launcher that, in addition to firing conventional ammunition, would also fire the Shillelagh missile. A high-drop pneumatic suspension provided improved cross-country ride quality and also allowed the entire tank to be raised or lowered by the driver. The United States team was led by General Motors while the German team consisted of a consortium of firms. The collaboration between the 2 teams was rocky from the start, with many cultural differences and disagreements about the design hampering progress. Germany favored a tank optimized for the terrain of Central Europe while the US attached importance to operating anywhere in the world. The Germans had reservations about the Shillelagh missile and developed a 120mm high-velocity gun as an alternative. Perhaps the most contentious disagreement, never fully resolved, concerned the measurement system to be used in drafting. Germany became concerned with the excessive weight of the tank. In light of growing costs, delays and overall uncertainty as to the soundness of the tank design, the United States and Germany ended their MBT-70 partnership in 1970. The US Army began work on an austere version of the MBT-70, named XM803. Systems were simplified or eliminated altogether and the unreliable autoloader was improved. These changes were ultimately insufficient to allay concerns about the tank's cost. Congress cancelled the XM803 in December 1971 but permitted the Army to reallocate remaining funds to develop a new main battle tank. Starting afresh, edit. The Army began the XM815 project in January 1972. The Main Battle Tank Task Force, MBTTF, was established under Major General William Disabry. The task force prepared design studies with the technical support of Tank Automotive and Armaments Command, TACOM. TACOM began examining specific goals. To this end, a new design basis emerged in February 1973. It had to defeat any hit from a Soviet gun within 800 m, 2,600 feet, and 30 degrees to either side. The tank would be armed with the 105mm M68 gun, a licensed version of the Royal Ordnance L7, and a 20mm version of the M242 Bushmaster. The Army later deleted the latter from the design, seeing it as superfluous. In spring 1972, Disabry was briefed by the British on their own newly developed Burlington armour from the British Army's labs. The armour performed exceptionally against shaped charges such as heat rounds. In September, Disabry convinced the Army to incorporate the new armour. To take full advantage of Burlington, also known as Cavorn, the new tank would have to have armour around 2 feet thick. For comparison, the armour on the M60 is around 4 inches thick. General Creighton Abrams set the weight of the new tank at 58 short tons, 53 t. The original goal of keeping weight under 50 short tons, 45 t, was abandoned. At the time, the Pentagon's procurement system was beset with problems being caused by the desire to have the best possible design. This often resulted in programs being cancelled due to cost overruns, leaving the forces with outdated systems, as was the case with the MBT-70. There was a strong movement within the Army to get a new design within budget to prevent the MBT-70 experience from repeating itself. For the new design, the Army set the design to unit cost at no more than $507,790, equivalent to $3,699,000 in 2023. The Pentagon's approach to control of research and development was modified with the XM-1. Previous acquisition strategy called for a significant amount of the design work to be done by the government. Under the new framework, contractors would competitively bid their own designs rather than compete solely for the right to manufacture the end product. In January 1973, the U.S. Army issued the XM-1, as the XM-815 had been renamed in November 1972, request for proposals. In May 1973, Chrysler Defense and General Motors submitted proposals. Both were armed with the 105mm M68 gun, the licensed L7, and the 20mm Bushmaster. Chrysler chose a 1,500 HP Lycoming AGT 1500 gas turbine engine. Graham's model was powered by a 1,500 HP diesel engine similar to that used on the American MBT-70 and XM-803. Prototypes, edit. Prototypes were delivered in 1976 by Chrysler and GM armed with the M68E1 105mm gun. They entered head-to-head testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The testing showed that the GM design was generally superior to Chrysler's, offering better armor protection, and better fire control and turret stabilization systems. During testing, the power packs of both designs proved to have issues. The Chrysler gas turbine engine had extensive heat recovery systems in an attempt to improve its fuel efficiency to something similar to a traditional internal combustion engine. This proved not to be the case. The engine consumed much more fuel than expected, burning 3.8 US gallons per mile, 890 L/100 km. The GM design used a new variable compression diesel design. By spring 1976, the decision to choose the GM design was largely complete. In addition to offering better overall performance, there were concerns about Chrysler's engine both from a reliability and fuel consumption standpoint. The GM program was also slightly cheaper overall at $208 million compared to $221 million for Chrysler. In July 1976, the Army prepared to inform Congress of the decision to move ahead with the GM design. All that was required was the final sign-off by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Back to the drawing board, edit. The finalized M1 scale model. On the 20th of July 1976, United States Secretary of the Army Martin Hoffman and a group of generals visited Deputy Defense Secretary Bill Clements and Director of Defense Research and Engineering Malcolm Curry on their decision. They were surprised when Clements and Curry criticized their decision and demanded that the new tank have a turbine. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld heard arguments from both parties in the afternoon. The Army team spent the night writing briefs and presented them to Rumsfeld the next morning, who then announced a 4-month delay. Within days, GM was asked to present a new design with a turbine engine. According to Assistant Secretary for Research and Development Ed Miller, it became increasingly clear that the only solution which would be acceptable to Clements and Curry was the turbine. It was a political decision that was reached, and for all intents and purposes that decision gave the award to Chrysler since they were the only contractor with a gas turbine. In the meantime, in September 1976, 3 West German Leopard 2 AV prototypes were belatedly sent to Aberdeen for comparison testing. Germany had signed a somewhat vague Memorandum of Understanding in 1974 committing both parties toward commonality in tank parts. Germany had assumed that its tank would be evaluated against the GM and Chrysler's prototypes and that the best tank would be chosen for production. This misunderstanding arose from the fact that in public statements both countries had overrepresented the MOU as an agreement that Germany and the US would select a common MBT. In reality, the US Army was unwilling to choose a foreign tank unless it was obviously superior in design and cost. In any case, in evaluations the Leopard 2 AV was found to meet US requirements but was thought to cost more. The US Army announced in January 1977 that Germany had withdrawn the tank from consideration. Chrysler is chosen, edit. Having narrowly averted losing the contract, Chrysler set about improving the design. Expensive components were replaced with less expensive ones. Chrysler's team also negotiated lower costs from their subcontractors. The price of the redesigned tank's turret especially was decreased, but other improvements came from unexpected places, such as a $600 hydraulic oil reservoir replaced with a $25 one. Chrysler also submitted a version with a Teledyne AVCR 1360 diesel engine. Chrysler's new bid came to $196 million, down from $221 million in the original proposal. Graham's proposal replaced the diesel engine with an AGT 1500 turbine and integrated a turret capable of mounting either the 105mm or 120mm gun. Cost growth pushed the tank bid to $232 million from $208 million. Although the GM team had successfully integrated the turbine, Bauer was more impressed by the cost savings introduced by the Chrysler team's redesign. On the 12th of November, 1976, the Defense Department awarded the $4.9 billion development contract to Chrysler. The turbine engine and cost do not appear to be the only reason for the selection of Chrysler. Chrysler was the only company that appeared to be seriously interested in tank development. The M60 had been lucrative for the company. In contrast, GM made only about 1% of its income from military sales, compared to 5% for Chrysler, and only submitted their bid after a special plea from the Pentagon. 11 XM1 pre-production models were manufactured between February and July 1978 at Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant. Quality problems with the engine quickly became apparent in testing. The first pre-production units that arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in March 1978 had serious problems. The tank accumulated mud and dirt under the hull which led to thrown tracks. Chrysler installed a scraper to prevent the buildup of dirt. This did not solve the issue entirely. It was determined months later that a gauge used to tension tracks was miscalibrated. This caused the tracks to be fitted too loosely. Another problem was the ingestion of debris by the engine. The problem was determined to be caused by poorly fitting air filters. At Fort Bliss, several tanks experienced transmission issues. It was determined that the tankers at Fort Bliss had discovered that they could throw the vehicle directly from acceleration into reverse, a tactically advantageous maneuver called the bow tie. Chrysler resolved this by installing a device that prevented this. The problems found during testing were easily surmounted. Critics of the M1 program emerged in the early 1980s, particularly the newly formed Project on Military Procurement, PMP, later renamed the Project on Government Oversight. PMP took issue with the tank's vulnerability, high price, reliance on flammable hydraulics, and high fuel consumption. American tank historian Stephen J. Zalagar characterized American press criticism of the M1 during this time as ill-founded. Zalagar wrote the issues uncovered by the tank trials were not particularly serious. PMP's criticism failed to generate any serious opposition to the program, which maintained strong support from Congress and the Pentagon. Responding to some of the alleged issues with the tank in King of the Killing Zone, 1989, journalist Or Kelly wrote that the truth is close to the opposite. Kelly said the program ranks as one of the Army's best managed, producing a tank in a remarkably short time while avoiding gold plating and utilizing effective competition. Production starts, edit. Low-rate initial production, RIP, of the vehicle was approved in May 1979. In February 1982, General Dynamics Land Systems Division, GDLS, purchased Chrysler Defense, after Chrysler built over 1,000 M1s. A total of 3,273 M1 Abrams tanks were produced during 1979-1985 and first entered U.S. Army service in 1980. Production at the government-owned, GDLS-operated Lima Army Tank Plant in Lima, Ohio, was joined by vehicles built at the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, DATP, in Warren, Michigan from 1982 to 1991. DATP also produced the 11 pre-production models in 1978. The U.S. Army Laboratory Command, LABCOM, under the supervision of the United States Army Research Laboratory, ARL, was also heavily involved with designing the tank with M1A1 armor-resistant shells, M829A2 armor-penetrating rounds, and improved weapon range. The M1 was armed with the license-built M68A1 version of the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun. The tank featured the first of its kind Cavorm armor. The M1 Abrams was the first to use this advanced armor. It consisted of an arrangement of metal and ceramic plates. An improved model called the IPM-1 was produced briefly in 1984 and contained upgrades to armor and other small improvements. 120mm gun M1A1, edit. M1 Abrams tanks being refurbished at the Anniston Army Depot in 1989. A number of considerations had led the service and its contractors to favor the Army's standard M68 105mm gun over Germany's 120mm Rheinmetall RH-120 smoothbore gun for the XM1. To begin with, the 105mm gun was the smallest, lightest, and least costly gun adequate for the job. Indeed, new kinetic energy ammunition for the weapon then under development by the Army promised to extend the gun's usefulness well into the future. And because the Army's other tanks, the M60 and the upgraded M48, as well as the tanks of virtually every other NATO nation, used the 105mm gun, mounting that gun on the XM1 promised to increase standardization within the alliance. Moreover, the continuing development of the new ammunition for the XM1 automatically upgraded every other gun in NATO. For all of these reasons, the XM1's development proceeded on the assumption that the 105mm gun would probably be the eventual main armament. The tripartite British, American, German gun trials of 1975 produced a general agreement in the U.S. Defense Department that at some future point, a 120mm gun of some design would be added to the XM1. Apparently anticipating this, Chrysler and GM had both made changes to their tanks during development to make them compatible with a variety of main guns. In January 1978, the Secretary of the Army announced that the Rheinmetall 120mm gun would be mounted on future production versions of the XM1. This decision established the requirement for a separate program for the M1E1, with 120mm gun, so that the XM-1 program could continue unimpeded. About 5,000 M101 Abrams tanks were produced from 1986 to 1992 and featured the M256 120mm smoothbore cannon, improved armor, consisting of depleted uranium and other classified materials, and a CBRN protection system. Production of M1 and M101 tanks totaled some 9,000 tanks at a cost of approximately $4.3 million per unit. In 1990, a Project on Government Oversight report criticized the M1's high costs and low fuel efficiency in comparison with other tanks of similar power and effectiveness such as the Leopard 2. As the Abrams entered service, they operated alongside M60A3 within the US military and with other NATO tanks in various Cold War exercises which usually took place in Western Europe, especially West Germany. The exercises were aimed at countering Soviet forces. Adaptations before the Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, gave the vehicle better firepower and nuclear, biological and chemical, NBC, protection. Gulf War, edit. Abrams tanks move out on a mission during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. A Bradley IFV and a logistics convoy can be seen in the background. The Abrams remained untested in combat until the Gulf War in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm. The first Abrams tanks to arrive in Saudi Arabia in August 1990 in the build-up to the war were M1 and IPM-1 tanks with 105mm guns. All but 2 battalions of 105mm gun Abrams tanks were replaced by M101 tanks prior to the American invasion in January 1991. The U.S. Army deployed a total of 1,956 M101s, 733 M101, 1,233 M101Ha, to Saudi Arabia to participate in the liberation of Kuwait. The U.S. Marine Corps deployed 353 tanks, of which 277 were M60s and 76 were M101. 60 M101Ha and 16 M101 Common. The M101 Common variant included adaptations for deep wading and improvements to increase commonality with the Army's Abrams. The 2nd Tank Battalion was equipped with M101Ha Abrams borrowed from the Army. The M101 was superior to Iraq's Soviet-era T-54/T-55 and T-62 tanks, as well as T-72 versions imported from the Soviet Union and Poland. Polish officials stated that no license-produced T-72, nicknamed Lion of Babylon, tanks were finished before destruction of the Iraqi Taji tank plant in 1991. Iraq's T-72s, like most Soviet export designs, lacked night vision systems and then modern rangefinders, though they did have some night fighting tanks with older active infrared systems or floodlights. Very few M1 tanks were hit by enemy fire and none were destroyed as a direct result of enemy fire, none of which resulted in any fatalities. 3 Abrams were left behind the enemy lines after a swift attack on Talil airfield, south of Nasrieh, on the 27th of February. One of them was hit by enemy fire, while the other 2 became embedded in mud. The tanks were destroyed by U.S. forces to prevent any trophy claim by the Iraqi army. A total of 23 M101s were damaged or destroyed during the war. Of the 9 Abrams tanks destroyed, 7 were destroyed by friendly fire and 2 intentionally destroyed to prevent capture by the Iraqi army. No M1s were lost to enemy tank fire. Some others took minor combat damage, with little effect on their operational readiness. The M101 could kill other tanks at ranges in excess of 8,200 feet, 2,500 m. This range was crucial in combat against previous generation tanks of Soviet design in Desert Storm, as the effective range of the main gun in the Iraqi tanks was less than 6,600 feet, 2,000 m. This meant Abrams tanks could hit Iraqi tanks before the enemy got in range, a decisive advantage in this kind of combat. In friendly fire incidents, the front armor and four-side turret armor survived direct upthrusts hits from other M101s. This was not the case for the side armor of the hull and the rear armor of the turret, as both areas were penetrated.